Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zafar, and I'm the outgoing student body president at Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa. I'd like to welcome you all to the first of our Youth Voice Forums, a series that aims to connect youth with elected officials, political figures, and community leaders. As the last few weeks and months have shown, our country is in the midst of unprecedented crises across social, political, and economic lenses. We are living at a time of profound change, and opportunities like this Youth Voice Forum give students the ability to ensure that their voices are heard, respected, and valued. Through today's Q&A with Senator Charles Grassley, students will have the opportunity to ask questions about issues that matter to them, topics that aren't regularly discussed by adult voters. Senator Grassley's Q&A will be the first of 6 that we have scheduled over the next 2 weeks with visionary leaders and political figures. At our next event at 2:30 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, we will be joined by former Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and former First Lady of Iowa Christy Vilsack. We hope to see you then and encourage all of you to continue submitting questions for our upcoming speakers. Now to introduce today's guest, please welcome Senior Student Council Member Ellie Miglin.
Thank you, Fez. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to quickly thank today's sponsors: CLE Productions, based in Des Moines, Iowa, Sites for Smiles and Smarts, and of course, the Roosevelt Student Council. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the privilege of kicking off our series of featuring Chuck Grassley, lifelong farmer. Charles Grassley was elected to the Iowa legislature in 1958, in which he served for 16 years before ascending to the United States House of Representatives in 1974. In 1980, Charles Grassley was elected to the United States Senate and has since represented Iowans in this position for almost 40 years. As the senator with the highest seniority at age 86, Senator Grassley serves as the President Pro Tempore of the United States Senate, making him third in line to the presidency. In his experience, Senator Grassley has served as the chair of the Senate Aging Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Narcotics Caucus, and he currently chairs the Senate Finance Committee. All of us here at the Roosevelt Student Council are tremendously honored and thankful for your time today, Senator Grassley, and it is our privilege to welcome you, sir.
I'm glad to be with you very much, and I would rather be with you in the beautiful library there at Roosevelt, where I met with Roosevelt students in the past. I thank Fez and Ellie for your leadership in this sort of thing. And I know that you've had a lot of adjustments since March when schools haven't met, and we've had the same adjustment in Congress. For instance, during a part of March and April, we didn't even meet for 5 weeks. And also I conducted from home by telephone and by email a lot of the stuff I'd normally do. Did a lot by phone, talking to constituents like I'm talking to you now. I'm glad to have this agenda with you. I wish it was more face-to-face. I guess it's face-to-face in the sense that I can see you and you can see me, but it's not quite as personal. The other thing is, I want to remind all young people about my intern program. If you come to Washington, although I do have interns for those folks of you in Des Moines, if you wanted to work in my Des Moines office, but quite frankly, it's a little boring compared to what goes on out here in Washington, D.C. And also invite people to follow me on grassley.senate.gov for my speeches and my press releases, so you know some of the things I'm involved in. I try to make good use of Twitter and Instagram. I don't do my own Facebook, but I do Instagram and Twitter to try to encourage discussion or give some information that maybe people wouldn't get through the media, things of that nature. So I think I'll stop there. If people want to know more about me as a senator and what we do process-wise, I'd be glad to answer those questions. So let's just simple. I'm sure you know, and I'm sure your students aren't going to be bashful. I'll try to answer every question I can. And if there's something happens, I don't give a complete answer and people want to follow up, I'd even take a follow-up. If somebody wants to disagree with me, I'd be glad to listen to what the disagreement is.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. And I think I speak for all students when I say that I think we all appreciate your engagement over social media and on Twitter, especially your long-standing feud with the History Channel. So thank you so much for your time today, sir. Today's format will be as follows. We are planning on having 7 students that have submitted videos. We will play those videos in front of you. They will discuss issues of importance to youth. But before we get to those audience questions, Ellie and I will each ask one question about current events that have been unfolding in recent weeks. Senator, your first question is about COVID-19, the virus that has had a severe impact on America's economy, health, and social interactions. Life as we know it has been largely altered over the last few months as over 100,000 Americans have died. Throughout this timeline, debate has ensued regarding decisions by our country's leadership on all levels, from local to federal. Senator, looking at the federal level, do you think Congress and the President should have responded to this crisis differently? If so, how? And in addition, what needs to be done moving forward to help America emerge from this?
I think we should have addressed it sooner, but the trouble is China did not work with telling the rest of the world of human-to-human transmittal until about the middle of January. It was all animal-to-human transmittal, even considering the fact that Taiwan told the World Health Organization that it was human-to-human. But even the World Health Organization didn't get that information out until after the middle of January. So the first major action we took after January was sometime around, I believe, January 23rd, when we stopped air flights from China to the United States. China stopped flights within their country way back in, maybe in December, but they never stopped flights around the world. So actually, we didn't have the information that we needed. But I can tell you this, things that we have learned since then are basically this, that we didn't have a pool of reserves, medical equipment, medical supplies, ventilators, things of that nature. We hadn't done enough work on vaccines because we didn't, this is a new virus. But once that we came to a conclusion of how bad this was, I think we were still maybe 3 or 4 weeks late taking the extreme action we did of shutting down the government, or the government shutting down the economy, and just isolating people. One thing that we didn't learn enough of was you should spend more time with this problem in nursing homes. And if you have people that have COVID-19, you shouldn't put them back into a nursing home. Now, those are more states making that decision than the federal government. We have found, and I'll stop here because I could go on and on. I think that one of the things that have come out of this is a lot of new testing that we probably wouldn't ever worried about if we hadn't had it. More kinds of tests, faster testing, still not fast enough, but ramping up very fast. And the other thing was we probably closed down the economy more than we needed to. But you know, you learn, and hopefully, if there's a rerun of this next winter, we don't do it. But if we get a vaccine, there won't be a rerun of this next winter.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Senator. My next question is to amid the political turmoil following the death of George Floyd, many people have personally reflected upon the impact of racism in shaping our nation. On an individual level, what have you personally learned from this collective national tragedy, and what are some policy initiatives that we can expect you to roll out in the following weeks and months in response?
Yeah. You know, seeing the actual committing of this murder with the policeman being warned that he shouldn't be doing that and not responding, just unimaginable. But you learn that what what would this person be thinking about? Was there so much hate in his mind? Or was he not thinking at all? Or what? But death happened, murder happened. And it happened to somebody that shouldn't happen. And what do we learn from it? I think the extent to which police need more training, but I think it's easy to blame 100% of the police rather than people that don't use good common sense. I think we've learned that you can have massive demonstrations that are peaceful. You learn that there is a very small percentage of people can take advantage of peaceful demonstrations to burn, rob, loot, you know, all those sort of things, and then give the other people a bad reputation. I don't think that they do get a few people think that way. I don't think that way. I know people peacefully demonstrating. And I think that you're going to find a review by Congress next week. Our Senate Judiciary Committee's going to look at if there should be a federal response. I don't want what I would call a federalization of policing, because I think things in New York are different than they are in, let's say, Des Moines, Iowa. But I think that there can be certain national standards and protocols that ought to be encouraged and followed. And I think also you look at, it brings to attention opportunities for people of minorities not being equal to that of people that are not minorities, things of that nature. I think that it brings to my personal attention more concern about promoting relationships greater than maybe we have in the past between, let's say, majority and minority, or between whites and blacks, or between whites and people of color. Things of that nature, I think, are very important.
Thank you, Senator. We very much appreciate it. Now we're going to move on to our first audience question, and this is being asked by Beckett, who is a rising junior in high school. So we're going to pull up that video now for you to watch.
Okay.
If another Supreme Court justice retires or passes away before this year's general election, will you stand by your 2016 statement that the Senate should, quote, fulfill its constitutional role of advice and consent by withholding support for the nomination during a presidential election year? If not, were your prior comments politically motivated?
Yeah, the answer is I would, because I made that commitment in 2016, because I was asked that very same question if this happened in 2020. Remember, I was chairman of the committee in 2015, 16, 17, 18. I'm not chairman of that committee now. So the question that came to me then, would I have a hearing on the nomination in 2020? I said, no, I would not. I would leave it for the next president or a re-elected president to make that decision. But Senator Graham, I haven't heard him speak to this point, but he's chairman of the committee, and if he decides to hold a hearing, he could have a hearing, and that would be his prerogative. But for me, I'd have to be consistent with what I said in 2016.
Sure, thank you, Senator.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question comes from Pramit.
What are your thoughts on electoral reform on different levels, such as local and federal? Do you think we should explore new electoral formats, such as ranked choice voting or range voting?
I have followed that in other countries, and it leads to minority government. By minority government, I mean one political party not having a majority by itself, so it had to form coalitions with others. And I think it tends to split up society politically into so many different groups that you don't get mandate from an election, and I believe a mandate from an election is very important. So you have the right to whatever party comes out in the majority, that they have the right to, first of all, carry out their agenda. But if you don't like their agenda, you can hold them responsible. Whereas I think when you have coalition governments, it's very difficult to do that. And I like the system of having two political parties, so you can hold one or the other responsible. And it's not easy for either political party to avoid responsibility for whatever actions they might take.
Thank you very much, Senator. Our third audience question will come from Jacob, another student in high school.
I can't hear Jacob.
Iowa.
I'm sorry, can we start that video again, please?
Yeah, please.
What are you doing to advocate for LGBTQ students?
Yeah.
I can just reread the question. He was asking, what are you doing to advocate for LGBTQ students in Iowa?
Well, whatever I would do would affect the entire country, not just Iowa. But first of all, I think regardless of what your background is, that you have a right to be respected for who you are. And I look at it kind of, and this may sound a little sentimental to you younger folks, because I don't know whether you view things the same way I do, but as a follower of Jesus Christ, I think that I have a responsibility to see everybody for their good or their bad, not for whether they're people of color or people of other races, what their sexual orientation is, LGBTQ, etc., and just treat everybody as an individual. I think the love of Jesus Christ is where I come from, and that means that you treat everybody as a equal and as a human being.
Great, thank you, Senator. Our fourth question is by Taylor, who just graduated from Roosevelt.
I'm sorry, can we start that video over? I think we're having some audio issues.
Can you read her question for me?
Definitely. Hold on. So you were the chair of the Judicial Committee and championed the Whistleblowers Act. There has been extensive discussion lately from individuals who claim that they have been targeted for speaking out against our current president. Could you address the current limitations of the Whistleblowers Act and what you are doing to encourage people to speak out, especially in this administration? And if time permits, what do you see as the most important issues before the Finance Committee that you are currently chair?
Okay. I think I got two different questions. Let me answer the last question first as chair of the Finance Committee. For me, two things. Two problems that should be addressed right now. And I have a bipartisan bill on one and a partisan bill on the other that we think can be a bipartisan bill with a little bit of negotiation. The first of it deals with the price of prescription drugs. I have a bipartisan bill with Senator Wyden of Oregon. He's the leader of the Democrats on our committee, to get down the price of prescription drugs. Not only that, but to bring transparency to the system. There's too much secrecy in the pricing of drugs, and to also save the taxpayers money, because we spend billions of dollars as taxpayers on prescription drugs through Medicare, Medicaid, and other government health programs, but also to make it cheaper for the consumer as well. So the other issue is, it may sound kind of boring to you, but we have some pension systems like one company has, let's say John Deere has. Those don't have so much trouble. But then we have multi-employer pension plans. and a lot of them are in very serious trouble, and people that are getting good retirements now in a few years could miss out and get a dramatic reduction in their retirement, not in their Social Security, but in their retirement. And we have a bill to fix that. Those two things are my goal for the end, between now and the end of the year. On the first one on whistleblowers, the first thing I like to remind people, and I try to remind people that come to my office, is cabinet nominees and positions of importance, because whether you got 10,000 people working under you or hundreds of thousands of people working under you, and you're heading that organization, there's a lot could go wrong. And whistleblowers are the people that help bring that to everybody's attention. So I consider most whistleblowers, some of them are cranks, but very few of them. Most of them are just patriotic people that want to have government do what the law says government should do. And so they see something wrong, they come and report it. We have whistleblower protection laws, but quite frankly, I have to tell you, a lot of people ruin themselves personally and professionally by doing it. So the law's gotta protect them, and if they come to Chuck Grassley, I gotta do what I can to protect them. And but they're there because government's a big operation. It ought to be serving the people the way the law requires it, and when it isn't, it needs to be exposed. And actually, it ought to be exposed at the lowest level of where these people work, and it ought to be corrected there. But eventually, they feel so strongly about it, they go up the ladder, and eventually they might come to a Senator Grassley because they're so frustrated and nobody's listening to them. Something's wrong. And it's very important to have good government, and whistleblowers are a great contributor to good government.
Thank you, Senator. Your next question will come from Ian Roth, a rising junior in high school. And in case we have any audio issues with this one, I'd be happy to read the question out loud as well. So
thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Senator Grassley, what are you doing to overcome political differences in the Senate?
You know, this is, thank you very much for that question. And it's one that I get almost all the time at my open town meetings in Iowa. I don't know how much I get it by email. I probably get it a lot by email too, but it's almost a foregone conclusion that every one of my 99 county meetings where I have Q&A with students like you, or just an open town meeting, or with people at the factory or people at the Rotary Club, the question kind of goes like this, although I'm not detracting from the way you worded it, but they'd say, how come you guys can't get along? They mean, how come Republicans, Democrats can't get along? So I'd like to give you a real long answer. But first of all, there's a difference between the House and the Senate, because in the Senate, when you have to have 60 votes to get anything done, and you got 53 of one political party, you got to have some bipartisanship or nothing gets done. Whereas in the House of Representatives, if the majority sticks together, they can ignore the minority. So that's why I try to have a lot of Republican, Democrat co-sponsorships of bills that I'm involved with. The other thing is, you got to remember that at the grassroots of America, all you got to do is look at the map for the last presidential election. Practically the whole country's red except along the coast. So don't forget, at the grassroots of America, the people are divided as well. So if you think that Congress is supposed to represent the views of their constituents, you would expect some of that to be reflected in the Congress. It ought to be reflected a little bit more in a not patronizing way, but in a cooperative way, where you know you got to get together. But I'd like to answer your question for me personally. If you would go to Georgetown University's Senator Richard Lugar Institute, he's dead now, but he set up this institute, and for the last 5 or 6 years, they've always rated the 100 senators by how much they work in a bipartisan way. And I've always been in the top 10. of that group. This year I was 10th, but sometimes I've been 5, 6, or 7. So you can see that maybe the answer to your question is that they ought to do the stuff the Chuck Grassley way, or you could say the Susan Collins way, or you could say I forget the other people that are in the top 10, but Susan Collins would be the best example, because I think she always comes out number 1 in bipartisanship.
Great, thank you. Our next question ties in really well with what you were just talking about. As you well know, both major parties have seen serious internal change in recent years. The upcoming presidential election is being seen as a referendum on each party by many onlookers, as its outcome may very well decide the long-term growth and existence of both the Democratic and the Republican parties. Should President Trump win or Vice President Biden win, how do you see the impact of either scenario playing out upon each party?
Well, I think that is kind of how you look at what government ought to function. Should government be a major participant in the economy? In other words, should I tax you more and spend your money for you? Or should I let you keep more of it and let, instead of having 535 members of Congress decide how to divide up the pie or a bigger part of the pie? Would it be better to let 160 million working Americans decide how to use their resources? Now, obviously, it sounds like I don't think the government ought to be doing anything, because we do tax people and we decide how to spend that money. But it depends upon whether you want to spend that money for things that are legitimately for government to do, which generally then would say more of it ought to be left to the private sector. I happen to come down on the side of we got political freedom, we have a free market system, we have a social system that people that can, through their own ingenuity, that could be work of their muscle or work of their mind, they decide what they want to do, and you do it, the next person does it, 160 million people are doing, collectively, that adds up to the economy and the political system of the United States. And I think that's also falls, what you studied in political science, the principle of limited government. Now, I think Republicans tend, and I'm a Republican, tend to believe in the principle of limited government more than the Democrats do. But I don't want to say they don't believe in it at all, because we still have limited government under them, but a little less limited government. So I think that that's the issue coming up in this election. Now, maybe I didn't answer your question, so if I didn't, follow it up with another one, and I'll try to be more explicit.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Our next question is now a student's named Josh. Excuse me. He's a high school student here.
Okay.
I don't think the audio is working, so I'll quickly just say it. As you know, Iowa is built on agriculture, and one of the greatest international contributors to global climate change is agriculture. As a senator and farmer, how do you think Iowa and its farmers should decrease not only their greenhouse gas emissions, but also agricultural pollution, fossil fuel use, and overall environmental impact?
And that question is from Josh Schilling.
Okay. Josh, I think that a lot of this is underway, and probably so slowly over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's hardly noticeable. But I think in terms of the number, I started out farming when I was probably 26, 27 years old after Dad died. And, you know, we used to make trips across the field with discs, with plows, with corn planters, with cultivators, all of that burning a massive amount of energy and taking a massive amount of labor. Starting maybe a couple decades ago, we started doing no-till. So on our farm today, we go into last year's corn stalks, haven't touched the ground since last fall, drill in our soybeans and spray for weeds once, maybe twice at the most, and then wait until you harvest a crop in October. Less labor intensive, less energy intensive, and less energy is less CO2 in the air, or the process that we call minimum tillage, where you might go in and till the soil a little bit, but you don't go over like I did in the 1960s with a disc, with a plow, with a planter, with you know, all the trips you make and all the energy and all the labor it takes. We're very efficient. When you're efficient, not only in labor saved and energy saved, but when I started farming, we raised about 60 bushel of corn to the acre. Last year, we're raising about 100, in my farm, about 190, but the state average, I think, was about 200 bushel the acre. So see what we're producing in the way of food compared to the energy and the labor we spent compared to 50 years ago. I think all those things have contributed to a better environment. If that was the basis of his question, mostly environment is the way I interpret it, but also greenhouse gases and all the stuff that goes with it.
So, Senator, just a quick follow-up. Do you think that more regulation is needed, or do you think that regulation should stay the same, or should it be diminished, the amount of regulation in place?
I think an example of more regulation that I opposed, and let me explain, it was called Waters of the U.S. WATUS as an example. There was a map of the United States that would have had about 97% of our total land subject to that regulation. It would have almost, I'm sure people are going to say, well, this can't be true. Maybe you have to have a permit to do normal farming operation. Now the regulators that wrote it said, well, when Grassley says that, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But you see, you don't know what, you pass a law today, down the road, 10 years from now, what's a regulator going to do? So that would be an instance where not more regulation, but regulation for soil conservancy, very important. We have regulation on what chemicals can be used. That's very important, not only for the environment, but it's important for personal safety. So if you're asking me, do we need regulations? Yes. But they've got to be reasonable regulations, and they shouldn't regulate every move a farmer makes.
Sure. Our next audience question will come from Ryan Bird, who just graduated from North Polk and Roosevelt. So that question's from Ryan Bird.
Senator Grassley, in 2008, you worked hard to push for the Inspector General Reform Act, which safeguarded the role of Inspector General, especially in presidential accountability. What are your thoughts on the President's recent decision to fire up to 5 Inspector Generals without providing our Congress with the information you pushed so hard to require?
Well, I'm in the middle of that right now, so you couldn't ask more appropriate question. First of all, I think you probably wouldn't ask the question if you didn't have know that I have a reputation defending Inspector Generals. I've been involved in the last 25 years in maybe advocating that some Inspector Generals be fired, and they have been fired, maybe in 4 or 5 cases. I say that because I want the Inspector General to do their job, and when they aren't, they shouldn't do it. Now, we have an Inspector General law that requires the president to give a 30-day notice and a reason for firing somebody. So what's wrong with what, in some of the cases that were just brought up here for this question, we didn't have that notification and didn't have a reason. So the Constitution's pretty clear, the laws are pretty clear. A president can hire and fire. We aren't arguing with that. We're arguing with the law being followed, and we need a reason for it. So I think that finally the most recent cases that the question might come from is things that are going on right now. And I think I'm going to have some reasons from this administration why at least 2 of these people were fired, and they're the 2 that I raised the most question about. There's one other that was fired. I've been following his work as Inspector General, and I didn't think he was doing a very good job. Now, that's just my judgment. I wouldn't want to say that that's uniform throughout the city, and I'm not sure that the president got rid of that one just because I didn't think he was doing a good job. But inspector generals are very important because you studied in your government classes in high school, and you'll study again in college if you take these courses, what we call checks and balances. Congress doesn't just pass laws and appropriate money. We have a responsibility after we do that to make sure that the executive branch of government carries out the laws the way Congress intended, spend the money the way Congress intended. I spent a lot of time on oversight or making sure that laws are faithfully executed, but we also, about 40 years ago, set up a system of inspectors generals in each department to do exactly the same thing. So I see them as helping me carry out my constitutional responsibility of checks and balances.
Senator, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up question. This was actually submitted by Nathan Hoffman, a student at Grinnell College here in Iowa. Unfortunately, we were unable to feature a video of his question, but what he asked ties directly to what you were saying, and he was asking, how do you feel about how in the last few decades we have seen a shift of power that seems to be accumulating within the executive branch and less so within the legislative branch, and what needs to be done to respond to that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's all Congress's fault. Under the Constitution, we got the sole power to legislate. So when Congress when Congress delegates power to the executive branch of government to write regulations instead of Congress passing it as law, there's a tendency to always blame a president that exercises that power. But you got to blame Congress for delegating it in the first place or giving up some of its legislative authority. So I think it's very bad. But it's been going on, let's say, for 60, 70 years. Probably got worse starting in the 1960s, but still a long time. And once Congress passes a law and you realize you gave up too much authority, remember you got to pass another law to take that back. And it's very difficult, particularly if a president doesn't want to give up something Congress gave them, and then he vetoes it, then you got to actually have a 2/3 vote that Congress did something stupid. So a bill I'm working on here, and I'm sorry to tell you, I can't get a bipartisan cooperation on it. I don't even get as much Republican cooperation on it as I ought to. But in 1962, Congress under President Kennedy voted a trade law giving the president authority to put tariffs on almost anything, all in the sense of national security. But the term national security can be abused, and President Trump is one of those presidents that abused it. But he's doing what Congress allowed President Kennedy to do and every other president to do it. So I'm trying to get a consensus not to completely repeal the 1962 law, but to modify it to restrict in certain ways that the president can only exercise it. In other words, getting a little bit of this delegated authority on international trade. And the reason for it is pretty simple, because the power to regulate interstate and international trade is a sole power. It's one of the 18 powers delegated under the Constitution of the Congress of the United States. So there's no doubt about we wouldn't have to give the president any authority in that area. But that's what happens when it's kind of a slippery slope.
Sure. Senator, your final question will come from Ellie.
Thank you again. As the last 4 years have shown, the realm of politics always appears to be shifting. What upcoming changes do you foresee within the political arena, and can you name one that might excite you?
One what?
One change in the political arena that excites you.
Oh, that excites me. Okay. I think the one we just talked about, if there's any power if there's any opportunity to get more power back to Congress that we gave up too much over the last several decades, would be the number one. I think that that the trend that is continued under this president, if he's reelected, I think it will continue, that I very much appreciate is, and sometimes it goes back to the same thing we're talking about, Congress delegating too much authority to the executive branch, lessens the power of the legislative branch. Then when you have the Supreme Court make certain rulings that seem to usurp legislative authority, that weakens the legislative branch. And so the appointment of strict constructionists to the Constitution, so people that are judges interpret law and don't try to make law. And the reason for that, obviously, is if you don't like the laws I make, you can vote me out of office. But when you get on the Supreme Court, you got a lifetime appointment. You only get rid of them by impeachment. So consequently, if they do something you don't like, there's not much you can do about it unless you can get Congress to pass a law overriding them. And once in a while that happens, but not very often.
Senator, I know you're a very busy person. Would you have time for one more question, sir?
Do I have time? Yeah.
Wonderful.
My staff is here, so I have to ask them.
Sure. There's a number of students that are watching this live, and we plan to post it online afterward for other students to watch as well. And we know that, regardless of their affiliation politically, I think a lot of them are politically interested, and many, may seek to pursue higher office. What advice can you give them? You've been serving for many decades within Congress, and then before that in the Iowa legislature. What advice can you give them if they want to pursue public service? What can they do?
Okay, well, you can do it through elective office, or you can do it through being an employee of some level of government. And that includes teaching and a lot of other things that you actually work for governments. If you're interested in the elective office, I'd say the younger age you can get involved in the political party of your choice, you should get involved. You should probably, I wouldn't necessarily advocate like I did running for office when you're 25 years old, but if you don't wait until you got gray hair to decide to run, and things of that nature, but you ought to work in the political system. That's something I didn't do because I was so young. I never did any work in the Republican Party until I was elected, and I think I would have been a better candidate if I had, but I still was elected anyway. But I think work in the political party of your choice, for sure, choose a political party, and then you might find it more educational to work for a candidate, and that could be on a full-time basis, or it could be on a part-time basis. And then I think work hard, and remember a rule that I think is good to follow: always tell the truth, and you don't have to worry about what you told somebody else. And whatever your constituency, particularly if you're coming to Washington, D.C., as opposed to going to Des Moines, if you want to be a legislator, don't forget your roots, because I think
Absolutely.
People resent it.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. If you have any closing remarks, please feel free to share them. And to, all of our viewers, we will plan on sharing the Senator's social media accounts and opportunities to apply to become one of his interns. So, Senator, if you have any closing remarks, please feel free to share them.
Well, what you've been observing here for 45 minutes is what I call representative government. Representative government's a two-way street. You kind of took the initiative on this, so I thank you for coming to me. But I also think those of us are elective offices. I probably wouldn't have thought about calling you up and having an event like this, but I try to do the same thing when I go to my 99 county tour to meet with people face-to-face, or meet with them in my office, things of that nature. So from both ends, if representative government's going to work, we both have to take the initiative to make it work, and that means talking to each other. And for me, I can't represent people if I don't know what's on their minds. You've had good questions about process, but you've had good questions about issues as well. And so, you know, it's a learning process, ongoing. So I always end my letters by saying, keep in touch. So I'm telling you to keep in touch.
Thank you very much, Senator. And to everyone who's watching, we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us today. It's obviously a very rare opportunity to hear from the President Pro Tempore within the United States Senate, and particularly a senator of such seniority such as Charles Grassley. We will plan on sharing his social media links with all of you, and again, opportunities to seek internships. We'd like to remind you that at 2:30 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday, we will be hearing from Secretary Tom Vilsack and former First Lady of Iowa, Christy Vilsack. We're still accepting questions if any of you have them, so please feel free to submit them through the registration link. You will be hearing from us in the next 48 hours, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Senator.
Thank you. You bet.
Stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much.